The Brazilian Archbishop Dom Heller Camara is famous for having said, "When I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor are hungry, they call me a communist." It is true enough that governments and corporations love to see charities filling the gaps of the social safety net, as long as we never actually challenge why the society has so many problems. It's a moral pillar for Christians, for Jews, for Muslims to be charitable. Giving to the poor is an inherent dimension of any sincere spirituality. But most of you will remember back during the moral majority days when they were attacking government social services in the 1980s. And Ronald Reagan on the campaign trail said that the government should get out of these social services and let the churches take care of the poor. He assumed, I suppose, that churches have lots of resources and that the only reason we weren't doing more for the poor was because the government was already doing it. And he said that the government should get out of the way of the private sector. Now, of course, Ronald Reagan didn't go to church, and he contributed almost nothing to these resources. I always wonder when I read in the opinion pages of the newspaper, people saying, you should tax the churches, and instead of building churches, they should be building homeless shelters. Like, how much of your money is involved in those decisions? That people have an imagination that we've got closets here with bales of money waiting to distribute. But the obvious truth is that churches have never been able to care for all of the poor of society. It is a dimension of our spirituality that we continue to feed the hungry and to care for the poor, but we are not the solution. The society itself must decide to collectively work towards actually taking care of poverty. Now, I'm no one to go around correcting Archbishop Camara, but I would restate his famous quote slightly differently, because the real question is not so much why are the poor hungry, the real question is why are there so many poor people? Poverty in the presence of abundance is just inexcusable. There is more than enough for everyone. We just won't distribute it in a way that is more just. The only reason we still have poor people in the world is because our economic system allows a tiny fraction of people to hoard the majority of our resources. You've heard the saying that possession is 9/10 of the law. Well, it's true, but think about who wrote the laws. There are lobbyists for the corporations that make military hardware. There's 3 lobbyists on Capitol Hill for pharmaceutical companies for every elected official up there. There are lobbyists for oil companies, for gas companies, even for coal. There just aren't any lobbyists for the minimum wage workers at McDonald's or even for the aides that are caring for our aging relatives in nursing homes. In fact, no one less than the Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith said that the modern conservative is engaged in one of humanity's oldest exercises in moral philosophy. That is, a search for a superior justification of selfishness. That we keep trying to somehow say that what we're doing is moral. The obvious irony is there is no moral justification for the levels of greed that exist in our society when there is no real reason for poverty to even exist, except for the fact that the rich control the government and the police. Ever since the ancient Phoenicians invented money, we've had a way of redistributing wealth. But the way that we have inherited in our day, and I want you to understand, the economic system in 2018 is not the same as the economic system of the 1960s or 1970s. Our economic system is always evolving. Every time Congress meets, new banking regulations, new loan protections and stuff are being passed. Our economic system today is not what it was 50 years ago. Our present system is dramatically skewed towards giving more and more to the wealthy and less to those who produce wealth. It has been broadly reported, and this is from USA Today, but you could find it in any number of sources, that the 3 richest Americans, all of whom are children of Sam Walton, have the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of the United States. 3 people have as much capital as 180 million people. 82% of the wealth created in the world last year, 2017, 82% went to the top 1% of the economy. Top 1%. There is no plausible defense for a system that distributes wealth in that way. We are in the midst of a moral crisis. Now, taxation, everybody hates taxes, but taxes are a form of capital redistribution, of wealth redistribution. The super wealthy, if they wanted to, they could have their own water system, they could have their own power generation, and they did until about a century ago. I mean, originally electricity was only being wired to the homes of the very rich. It was actually a social justice movement within churches on the East Coast that got electricity lines put up in poor neighborhoods. Taxes are what build utilities and roads and bridges and water systems and schools, municipal services of the police department, the fire department, highway maintenance, and medical services. But cutting taxes always seems like a popular political idea, and it's sold to the poor as if it's somehow going to help them. But the truth is, as in our recent major tax cut, the cuts put more money in the hands of the already rich, and it takes away services from the poor and the middle class. My own income is middle class, perhaps in terms of national averages on the lower side of the middle class, but the Trump tax cut resulted immediately in a $1,000 increase in my federal income taxes, and the affordable health care subsidies being cut has added $2,000 to $3,000 a year to my health care expenses. So the tax cut cost me $4,000. And if it happened to me, then it has to have happened to a whole lot of other people that are blue-collar workers or people that are middle or lower middle income. So why aren't they screaming? Why are they acting like somehow they are being benefited by an end to estate taxes, as if they were going to have an estate to tax? Duped. Yes, duped, absolutely. The greatest American advocate for the poor in the 20th century, I think, had to be Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker movement. And a reporter caught her. She was a very sincere Catholic lady who was very circumspect, but a reporter caught her in sort of an unguarded moment and got her saying, "Our problems stem from our acceptance of this filthy, rotten system." It's our acceptance of it. It's not that the way our economic system works is a necessary reality. It is the way the rich have designed an economic system that benefits themselves. Red states where very conservative governors have locked arms with the right-wing legislatures to cut taxes and therefore reduce government spending are now reaping the whirlwind. Teacher strikes recently broke out in West Virginia, and the success of those strikes gave courage to teachers in Oklahoma and Kentucky who are now finding the will to unite and strike for higher wages, smaller classrooms, and better funding for equipment and supplies. It's now been more than 20 years since Thomas Frank published this excellent book, What's the Matter with Kansas?, describing in detail how states that were formerly quite progressive were over a century seduced, as Mark said, duped, into consistently voting against their own interests. It's almost amazing to see how states like Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee, which are largely populated by lower income people, can be duped into voting to cut the taxes on the wealthy and thereby cut their own throats by having necessary services taken away from them. Trickle-down economics has never worked. And the notion that the tax cut would save corporations a lot of money and that they would then give raises and bonuses. And they did give some quite symbolically, but mostly they used that money to buy back stock to bring ownership back to the families that started the corporations. This is perhaps a bit earthy for church, but this is the Sunday after Easter, so only the core folks are here. So you won't mind me saying that trickle-down economics invites the rich to urinate on the poor and tell them that it's raining. In Oklahoma, the teachers went on strike only when the state, unwilling to pay them more, cut the school week to 4 days, sacrificing their own children's education to keep taxes lower. Now, the less educated you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican. So there is a connection there of undermining education in order to keep conservatives in power. And I don't want to throw any shade on Oklahoma this morning, but I've had reason to spend a good deal of time in Oklahoma over the past few years. And I can tell you that I don't see any problems in Oklahoma that can be helped by less education. But you understand what I'm saying. But for some reason, the poor and the middle class just keep going along with totally absurd tax structures until things get so absolutely desperate that you begin to see things like teacher strikes that honestly should have been happening 20 years ago. We've waited almost too long to begin to address the urgent need to make fundamental changes in our tax structure. A few years ago, the French economist Thomas Piketty published this book on capital in the 21st century, and it was on the New York Times bestseller list. I am totally green with envy for his book sales, but he's been identified as holding the record for the most books sold that were never read. A lot of people bought it because it's a very, very important book, and almost no one read it because, I mean, I bet a bunch of you have it on your shelf. It's about 1 million pages long, and it is very hard to read. But I read enough of it to summarize it for you in this way. The first is that you have to understand that there's a big difference between income and capital. Income is what we tend to worry about the most, and setting a higher minimum wage or a living wage or even a guaranteed basic income. But Piketty says that we've got to think about capital, what you own, the equity in your home, the value of your stock holdings, your savings, your pension funds, or any land that you may own. It's capital that ultimately makes the difference. The second thing to know about Piketty's book is that he says that way too few people own way too much of the capital in the world. That like I said, just 3 people in America own as much as the poorest half of America. And that if we are to have a future, if we are to ever defeat poverty, we have got to enter into a massive redistribution of capital. We can't just keep tinkering with income and really change the structure. We have to redistribute capital. And I've spent a good deal of time in Nicaragua, and I can tell you the poverty there is 4.5 million people that live in Nicaragua, and 3 million of them are living on the edge of starvation. It is a very, very poor country. But when you drive through the countryside in Nicaragua, there's vast expanses of land that are not being used. And they're not being used because they are owned by people in Europe or people in the United States. Even one of the biggest donors to my work in Nicaragua said to me before my last trip, if I could find a farm there for him to buy, he'd like to buy it. And he said, I don't want to operate a farm, I just want to own the land. That's the whole problem. You take land and resources out of active production so that someone can hold it as capital, as an investment for the future. But you're impoverishing everyone that lives around it. You can't keep tinkering with just income. If you don't change capital, you're not going to get there. But Piketty says in his book, this is the third and final point that I can get out of it, is that virtually no nation will do it. That it has to be done and no one's willing to do it. Because it turns out rich people put up a lot of resistance to the idea of you taking their capital and giving it to other people. And in a few weeks, I'm going back to England for another speaking tour. I've not been there for 3 years now, which only means that some of those churches have had enough time pass that they forgot what my last visit was like, so they're going to let me come back again. But when I was going in 2015, I asked one of my hosts if there was a book I could read that could help me kind of understand British current thinking, to be able to identify with the audience better. And I was surprised when he suggested this book by Russell Brand, Revolution. Initially, I didn't think he was even being serious, because Brand is better known for his drug use and rather ribald humor than for any social conscience. But I was surprised. I did buy the book and I did read it, and I was surprised that Brand has not only tried to sober up, but he's also actively sought a sincere spiritual life that has affected his worldview. Now, Brand, I'll tell you, is a lot easier to read than Piketty. But surprisingly enough, they seem to come to a lot of the same conclusions. The world's wealth is held in too few hands, and there absolutely must be a radical redistribution of wealth. But he also agrees with Piketty in the assumption that no nation will actually do it. So Brand says, don't bother voting. That only encourages them. You know, voting is a way of tricking the poor into thinking they actually have a voice in their own governance. He says we've got to have a major revolution. Brand hasn't lived through a revolution. We haven't either. I don't have any sense that we would like it if we lived through one. They don't appear to go well. The process is bloody. But if our politicians maintain this let them eat cake attitude about the poor, it may come to that. As President John Kennedy said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. Now, we began today with a passage from the New Testament scriptures, and you may think that I've forgotten all about the New Testament, but trust me, I'm still there. I titled this sermon on this passage from the 2nd chapter of Acts. Luke writes the first half of Acts as kind of early church propaganda, and it was a lot more propaganda and imagination than it was actual ecclesial history, but suffice it to say that the things that Luke is describing, he was not around to see. He wasn't there when it happened. I titled this sermon, The Ghost Community, because Luke is describing a community that everyone has dreamed of, but no one has ever seen. Or if they did, it didn't last long enough to sit for a good oil portrait. The evangelist says that the early church was so united, so moved by compassion and love for one another, that they sold everything that they owned. And they turned it all over to the apostles so that these church leaders could distribute resources to anyone who had need. Maybe that's what Reagan was remembering, you know. Who am I kidding? He didn't read the Bible. But there is this image of the idyllic, perfect community. I cannot emphasize enough that this is not a historical account. It is a religious narrative that is trying to say that the early church lived in a utopian way. But I doubt that Luke based this narrative on anything more than his imagination, an imagination that we've all had, that if the world were run as it should rationally be run, that everyone would have what they need. However, there have been some very serious attempts at actually creating utopian societies, particularly in America in the 19th century. There was a lot of idealism around, and the great American West was opening up to European settlements, and they tried to create utopian societies. There was one in New Harmony, Indiana, that's just a few hours' drive from here. If you ever find yourself going towards Louisville, Kentucky, you should take a diversion and go take the historical tour of New Harmony, which which actually that location hosted two different, radically different from each other, utopian experiments in societies. Where I grew up in Kentucky, there were two Shaker communities that also tried to live an absolute egalitarian lifestyle. There were other utopian societies in Massachusetts, in upstate New York, in Iowa. Some of them were religious, but some were decidedly opposed to all organized religion. The second one in New Harmony was intended to be rooted in science. The problem is that none of them succeeded for very long. I'm personally inclined to believe that their failure was rooted in scale, that you can't have a egalitarian community, you really need to have an egalitarian nation. But as we know from communist experiments, idealism always seems to fall prey to some giant egos that manage to grab power and ruin the whole thing. What I want to leave you with today, though, is the contrast between the ideal community, the one we've imagined, the one like ghosts we've all talked about and no one's ever seen, and the substantive reality where we live, where the ranks of the poor are growing rapidly because of a radical shift of capital into the hands of people who are already rich. I do, in large part, blame the rich and the powerful for creating and defending an economic system that creates so much suffering, so much poverty, and so much hunger and sickness. But even more, I blame the indifference of the masses who have apathetically allowed it to happen. As Dorothy Day said, we have accepted a filthy, rotten system, and we never should have. We never should have accepted it. If you, like me, do not want to see a violent revolution take place, either in our country or in other Western democracies, then we have to stop playing along with things like ending inheritance taxes that allow capital to keep flowing into the hands of the super wealthy where it never leaves. We have to stop quietly acquiescing to cuts in health care, to education, and pension benefits to the majority of the population. And folks, I would remind you that the crucial point of most of the civil rights movement had to do with voter registration and participating in elections. If you don't want Russell Brand to be right about a coming revolution, then the one thing we must do is vote. And frankly, I believe that actively registering voters might be one of the things that progressive churches really ought to be involved in a very big way, along with making voting count more by fighting against gerrymandering and all of these voter suppression efforts about photo IDs or closing down voting places or shortening the hours of voting. We need to help people to get involved in voting, and what we want to do every week is to help people to get over being duped. They have been tricked in the past to voting against their own interests. And I'm not ready to give up on democracy, but if we're not going to give up on it, then we've got to help make it work. And making it work means educating the voting public and getting the voting public to actually vote. That's my opinion. I could be wrong, but I think that's where I'm going to take my stand.
Amen. Amen.